Okay, good morning from the con of the Starship Enterprise here on the campus of UNR. Uh, Somebody shoot me a quick chat thing telling me if the audio is working okay this morning, and I'll kind of wait around for that. Uh, we got a little bit of housekeeping stuff to take care of, and then I want to talk or finish up what we were talking about on Friday, or not Friday, last lecture period. And then we'll move on and start talking about some wildlife things, and move forward and try and get off of some of this of necessity mathematics and calculations and whatnot. So that's kind of what I want to do. Okay, looks like everything's working pretty good. People are starting to log on. Uh, and so what I want to do is kind of give you first of all, give you a pathway or a glimpse at the pathway of what I'm seeing now between now and the end of the semester with respect to uh, the assignments and grade stuff that you guys are going to have to do the rest of the way. So okay, start with we're looking at. Uh, in addition to the one that I sent out yesterday, which I think was homework 5. Uh, by the way, I want that homework 5. I need that on Monday next week, so that'll be the due date for homework 5 that I sent out. I think I put that in the email, but I've slept since then. Uh, so, uh, in addition to number 5, we're going to have a number 6. And I promise it won't be any calculations. We'll have a number 6 homework that I've pretty well got worked out at this point in time, and we will. I'm not sure if we're going to do it next week or the week after, but we've got one more homework to do. Um, we've got one more exam to get through. I've already talked a little bit about the exam. We'll have to do some kind of take-home thing, and I'm working my way through that, trying to get the logistics taken care of for that. Um, then we have to do something to replace. Typically, what we do are some mock congressional hearings, and so I'm about 90% through working that one out for you, and I hope to be presenting that to you next week, maybe even on Monday. If everything goes well, we'll get that out to you on Monday, and you can start working on it. I think you're going to have a lot of fun working with it. It's going to require you to make some phone calls and do some interviewing and writing something up. But it's going to be on wild horses and burros, some aspect of that challenge. So I hope to have that thing ready for you on Monday to email out to you. There is a possibility I might be able to get it out on Friday, but certainly on Monday I'm going to try and get it out to you, let you get started working on that one. And then we've got one more thing to do, one more assignment to do that will replace normally what we do as a final project. Usually we do a plan. A management plan as a final project on a piece of rangelands, but we just can't do that this time around because it takes too much of my time one-on-one with students coming by the office, and we can't do that under these circumstances. And so I'm putting something together. I've got an idea for that now, and I think you'll find it kind of fun and interesting as well. So basically what we're looking at, in addition to the homework number 5 that you have in your hands already, we've got 4 more assignments that grades can come from. And so you're looking at 100, 200, 325. You're looking at 325 points that I haven't given you yet. You've got 50 points in your hands now with homework number 4, which is due Friday, and homework number 5, which will be due on Monday. So that's what you're looking at for a total number of points that are left. And you can kind of compare that, figure out sort of where you're at. So That's where I want to go the rest of the semester. We've got some more lecture stuff to talk to, and I've got some PowerPoint things that I want to send you. But we're really gonna for a little while focus in on a couple of things, and that's the cheatgrass issue that we have in Nevada, which affects everyone, and the wild horse and burro issue in the western United States, and particularly in Nevada, which also affects everyone in one form or another. So that's kind of where we're going. And so, if that's not clear enough, let me know, and I'll try and clarify it even a little bit more. But that's sort of where I see things going the rest of the semester, and I'm working my way through the logistics. You can't just kind of flip a coin and make some of these things happen. So if it seems like it's taking some time, it's because it's taking some time to put together. So, okay, if you got any questions, serious questions on that, you can live chat it, and I'll try and pick it up. In the meantime, you can always email me as well if you're having trouble with the homeworks. Email me. I'm going to go through the emails that I have once we get done with class this morning. I'm going to go through the emails that I already have. I've already got a handful of them, and try and work those out between us, and get you down the road with it. So don't worry about that. I'm not ignoring you. I'm just, after class this morning, I'm going to start kind of tearing into those. So okay, good. We finished up on Monday, really talking about animal unit equivalents. An animal unit, of course, as you recall, that an animal unit month is one. Excuse me, sometimes I slip off into multidimensional space. An animal unit month is a forage term. An animal unit is an animal term. Okay, one animal unit equals one 1,000-pound cow with calf at side. It can be at side. Maybe she doesn't have a calf, but that's the definition of an animal unit: is one 1,000-pound cow with calf at side. The definition of an animal unit month, which is a forage term, is the amount of forage that one animal unit will consume in 1 month. And if we're talking about one animal unit based on a cow, based on 2% of body weight per day, it comes out to about 790 pounds per month, and that's dry weight. Often we just sort of round up and use the term, 800 pounds. As opposed to 790, because you can do 800 in your head, where 790 gets a little bit problematic if you're just kind of doing it in your head. So often we round it up to 800 pounds. You'll also see some things back east that equilibrates one animal unit to 1,000 pounds, because they figure they're going to trample 800 or trample or lay down on a couple of 100 pounds, and they might do that in a confined pasture situation, but on rangelands, that's not something that we're concerned about. So we use the figure 790 pounds per month, and often we'll round that up to 800 pounds. So you've got a table on your handout here of animal unit equivalents. Again, animal units are an animal term. It's not a forage term. And I've got things listed here like yearling cattle, elk, horses, burros, bighorn sheep, and how they compare with respect to one animal unit. In some cases, they may be more than one animal unit. In the case of horses and burros, and in the case of almost all of our wildlife species, with the exception of moose, they're smaller than one animal unit. So it takes more. If the decimal equivalent is smaller than 1, then it takes more of them than 1 to equal 1 animal unit. Okay, so just kind of keep those things in mind. So that's what we were talking about last time. We were kind of using using the example of a small dog versus a big dog. In the case of dosages, normally dosages for animals, for whether it's vaccinations or oral doses or of some kind of prophylaxis or serum, it's based on a per animal basis. And absolutely, there's a lot of difference between the sizes and breeds of dogs. You've got the little, foo-foo dogs, and then you've got one of my grand dogs that weighs 225 pounds. His head's as big as a hood of a car. It's as big as some engines I've seen. So, but it's still, the dosage is still based on a per animal basis. And there's you do have some leeway as a vet to sort of increase or decrease that with some medicines. But other medicines, you just don't have the ability to do that by law. And so hopefully that kind of gives you sort of a perspective of it. Maybe it takes, 30 Chihuahuas to equal Farley, my 225-pound English Mastiff grand dog, whatever you want to call it. And so it's sort of the same thing. So hopefully that kind of gets you to thinking about it in those terms, and so you can kind of manipulate these numbers a little bit. So let's take a look at these numbers that calculations that we have on the bottom half of that page, and we'll try and get through. Well, we won't try to. We'll get through those here this morning, and we'll start talking about some other wildlife issues. And what we're going to do, we calculated how much forage was available in the first couple of pages in your handout, and so we're going to pick up there and use that number and kind of continue to manipulate it a little bit, and see what we get at the end of it. So we're going to take that 254,100 pounds of available forage, and we're gonna adjust that. We're gonna make some water availability adjustments, and if let's say 50% of the pasture is at least 2 miles from water, and we go back to our tabular value, we use I'm looking for my tabular value here too. 1 to 2 miles distance from water, 1 to 2 miles. We need to reduce our capacity by about 50%. So if we take the 254,100 pounds and we reduce that by 50% because of what distance to water in the pasture, that leaves us about half of it. Not about half. That leaves us half of it. 127,050 pounds. Okay, even though there's more forage out there in the pasture, it's not usable. The animals just won't use it in this instance. Let's do a slope adjustment. Let's say 10% of the pasture has 15% slopes, and we look at our slope adjustment, and it says that when we have 11 to 30% slopes, we reduce the capacity by 30%. So the first thing that we do is we take 10% of the area, 0.1, times 0.3, the 30% adjustment. That leaves us with a decimal equivalent of 0.03, or a multiplier of 0.03. We multiply our 127,050 pounds by 0.03. And that gives us a 3,812 pounds worth of slope adjustment. Okay, that's how much we have to reduce it by. So then we have to take our 127,050 pounds, reduce it by 3,212 pounds, and we come up with 123 123,238 pounds of usable forage in that 2,200 acre pasture. Okay. So then we use our rule of thumb about how many usable AUMs there are in the pasture. 123,238 pounds. Divide that by 790 pounds, which is the equivalent of one, it's a forage term, it's an AUM. We divide 123,238 pounds by 790 pounds per AUM, and that equals 156 AUMs. We cancel out the pounds in our units and we're left with AUMs. So we've got 156 AUMs in the pasture. AUMs, remember, is a forage term. An AUM is a forage term. It includes two things: an animal unit and months. AUM. Animal units are just AUs. AUMs are AUMs. They're an animal unit, and it also includes a month. So let's pretend that the grazing period in this 2,200 acre pasture is 90 days. We have a permit for 90 days, or we've rented it for 90 days. How many mature cows can we put in the pasture? Well, if we know how much forage we have, which is the AUM, now we can determine, and we know how long they're going to be there. Now we can calculate how many animals we can actually put in the pasture. So it's just a simple little 3-variable algebra problem. Okay, we've got 156 AUMs. We know that, we calculated. We divide that by 3 months. 90 days or 3 months. It doesn't make any difference if it's a 31-day month or a 28-day month. Our months, when we're calculating forages and AUMs and stuff, are 30 days. Okay, so we got 156 AUMs. We divide that by 3 months. That means we can cancel the months in the units and we're left with AUs, right? Animal units. So 156 divided by 3 equals 52 animal units. And an animal unit is equal to 1 cow, right? So we have 52 animal units. We can put 52 mature cows out there for those 90 days. So once again, the animal unit month has two components to it. It has an animal unit and it has a month to it, and it's a forage term. So then we have this thing that we call a stocking rate. Stocking rate. And these are things that we use to compare one pasture or one ranch to another, or one ecological site even to another. So what is the stocking rate? Expressed as AUMs per acre or acres per AUM. You can express it either way. Usually it's AUMs per acre is probably more common. So let's calculate a stocking rate for this particular area, this 2,200 acre pasture that has this much forage on it for that 90-day grazing season. So we've got 156 AUMs divided by 220 acre, 2,200 acres equals 0.07 AUMs per acre. And the reciprocal is just the reciprocal of that. And that's 14.1 acres per AUM. So, you know, what that tells you, 14.1 acres per AUM, is it takes about 14 acres of this particular site, this particular ecological site, takes 14 acres to feed one cow for 1 month. That's all, you know, that's, when you boil it down, that's all that it means. And that's a matter, a way that you can compare one ecological site or one pasture or one ranch to another is through these stocking rates. Okay? Make sense? Pretty simple. Let's move to this next step here. Another question. Well, how many elk could graze the pasture if no other critters were there during the 90-day grazing period? I'll come back and catch questions here in just a minute. Let's get through this last question. So how many elk could graze the pasture? We know how many cattle could graze the pasture. We've just calculated that. How many elk can use the pasture? Well, the first thing that you have to understand is that if you look at your table, you go back and look at your table of your animal unit equivalents, an elk is smaller than a cow, correct? An elk is 0.7 of an animal unit. So the actual number of elk, since they're smaller than a cow, is going to be more elk than cows. You can put more elk in the pasture than you can put cows, because elk have smaller body size, and so an animal unit equivalent of 0.7 for an elk, you can actually put, that's the first thing that you know without even doing the math. So if we take 52 animal units, which is what we calculated, and we divide it by 0.7 elk per animal unit, we come up with 74 elk. That answer makes sense. If you multiplied 52 times 0.7, the answer is not going to make sense. So whenever you're doing calculations, it doesn't make any difference, what your calculations are, or whether you're working with dosages of antibiotics, measuring carpet. It doesn't matter. If your answer is not reasonable, then it's wrong. Okay? If your answer is not reasonable, then it's wrong. So if we understanding that an elk is smaller than a cow, obviously 0.7 is smaller than 1, that the number of elk that we're going to put in that pasture is going to be more than the number of cattle that we're going to put in that pasture. That makes sense. If you multiply 52 times 0.7, you come out with 36.4. I just calculated it up. And you think, well, okay, that's the right answer. If I just round it to 36, I can put 36 elk in that pasture. Well, you already know that you can put 52 cows in the pasture. And now you're telling me you have to put fewer elk in the pasture than you put cows in the pasture. That answer is not reasonable. It doesn't make sense. So in that case, it's wrong. If your answer doesn't make sense, if your answer is not reasonable, it is not going to be correct. So remember I was talking about editing the other day? Editing is your most powerful tool. Think your way through and edit what you're doing. Edit your math. Edit how you're manipulating your numbers. And if you do that, and one way to do that is make sure that you work your units through. A lot of people will just work their units through before they even put numbers to them, so that they know what the correct answer is going to be in units, and then they'll stick the numbers in. But editing is your most powerful tool. Okay, I'm going to look at a question here. So for the adjustments for water, the 50% is from the table, not from the question that says 50% of the pasture is at least 2 miles from water. That's correct. The 50% of the pasture, what you have to do when you're making corrections or making adjustments for distance from water, the amount that you reduce, the percentage, I should say, the percentage that you reduce is coming from the table. The 50% is coming from how much of the pasture is actually that far away from water. Okay, so I don't. Hopefully, I got that answered in a way that makes some sense to you. So, if we let me look at the question again here. If 50% of the pasture is at least 2 miles from water, the 2 miles from water reduction is from the table. The 50% part is just in the question that I wrote. I could have written 40% of the pasture instead of 50% of the pastures. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Read the question again and make sure that I understand it. So for the adjustment for water, the 50% is from the table, not from the question that says 50% of the pasture. Okay, makes sense. All right, good. That's great. So, live chat me any more questions you have on this right now, and we'll try and get them answered. Otherwise, I'm gonna move on to some wildlife stuff. And while I'm waiting on another questions, and once again, if you have questions when you're working this thing through, send me an email, and we'll work it out through email. If we can't, we'll figure out a way to get on the telephone, and we can do it over the telephone. So just let me know. I've got a question from a little bit earlier today that says, do you have a tentative time as to when the test will be? No, not yet. I don't. I would like to have it done, and as I mentioned the other day, the week that has the 24th of April in it, I would like for that Friday to probably be our last official online session. And so I think I can give you that anyway to tell you it will be no later than April the 24th. Now I'm hung up in my cord here. It would be no later than April the 24th. Chances are it'd probably be a little bit earlier than that. I'd kind of like to get it out of the way and use the last week or two that we have for these other for the finalization of these other two projects. So that's about the best I can do for you right now. Bear with me with this because this is all new to me too, and I'm trying to work out logistics that not only work for everybody's schedule, but also work in terms of how the material that we have to cover gets covered and when the material that we need to cover gets covered. So bear with me on that. But I think I can, I can tell you that it won't be any later than April the 24th, and will probably be before that. So, okay. Seeing no more further questions, I'm sure there'll be some on the emails here later on. Friday, that homework 4, I want it on Friday, and then the homework number 5, I want it on Monday, Monday morning, just like you would be handing it in for if we were meeting in a classroom somewhere. Hopefully, everybody's staying safe and not being too bored to death. Anyhow, I don't know how many of your jobs are actually been declared essential and non-essential. So hopefully, you're finding some way to entertain yourselves through this very, very odd period of history. Okay, then. Let's talk about wildlife and some wildlife livestock interactions. This is always a kind of a really fun one anyway for most students and for myself to talk about wildlife and how things have changed over the past several decades, even how things have changed during my career, just in my career, with respect to wildlife. on our public lands. It's pretty doggone amazing. And so as we as we take a look at the history of our rangelands and their use, if you remember way back in the before time, we were talking about the Taylor Grazing Act in 1934, and the primary use at that time of our public lands was for livestock grazing, for sheep and cattle grazing. We saw some mining going on our public lands during those days. We saw some oil and gas development, some very early oil and gas development. I know I worked on some old oil fields in Wyoming and in Montana that dated back to the 1920s. Of course, the Teapot Dome scandal that you probably read about in American history occurred in Wyoming, there north of Casper, Wyoming. I've worked on some old wells out there, and I actually even saw some old literally wooden pipelines from the teens and early 20s on some of our public lands out there north of Casper. So we did have some mining, and we did have a little bit of oil and gas development, primarily oil development at that time, prior to the Taylor Grazing Act. But at the time of the Taylor Grazing Act, the primary use of our public lands were, for homesteading, and for and in conjunction with homesteading, for livestock use. And so as time went on, and particularly by the time we got to the 1950s, it began in the 1930s, but certainly by the 1950s, we began to see societal values began to change. And people started thinking that wildlife was really cool. And of course, our wildlife numbers had really dwindled. There was in some states there weren't even any hunting seasons in the West until the 1950s and early 1960s. There just weren't. Wildlife was just sort of an overlooked resource, and people began to be concerned about our wildlife species and there's the sustainability of them on our public lands, and rightly so. And so we also saw some laws that were passed during that period of time. The Pittman-Robertson Act was passed in 1937, 3 years after the Taylor Grazing Act. And the Pittman-Robertson Act is still in effect today. It placed an excise tax on things like fishing rods, reels, fishing equipment, boats, things like that. And that excise tax, that today when you buy something from Cabela's or Bass Pro Shops or whoever they are this week, when you buy certain items, not all items, but when you buy certain items, there's an excise tax that's placed on that. It goes back to the federal government, and then the federal government turns it around and doles it back out to the state wildlife agencies in order for them to better manage wildlife species and fisheries. Then we had in 1950, we had the Dingell-Johnson Act, which really sort of ramped up federal aid for fisheries. And so we have a couple of acts on the books that actually sort of pay for wildlife management, pay for state wildlife management agencies to do their job and manage our wildlife species. And so society started saying, hey, what happened to the deer? What happened to the antelope? We know what happened to the buffalo. They were almost extirpated. And if it wasn't for the ranching industry, they would have been extirpated. But society's values started changing. They said, hey, wildlife has value. Fisheries has value. And today, this is beginning to be a huge problem. I was on a member of the White House Council on Wildlife Policy and Management, and one of the things that we saw as one of, if not the biggest threat to wildlife in the United States is the fact that no one or very few people, I should say it, put it this way, fewer and fewer people, including urbanites in that, are buying fishing licenses and buying fishing equipment and buying hunting equipment these days. In the 1950s and the 1960s, everybody went fishing. I mean, I Love Lucy television shows in the 50s. They had episodes of New Yorkers going fishing in upstate New York. It was a common thing, and we've lost that generational. What we've found was we've lost that generational rite of passage where grandfathers have taken their kids fishing, parents have taken their kids or taken their grandkids fishing, parents taking their kids fishing. This part of our society and culture that was ingrained in our culture for 100 years is really starting to lose its way. And so when people don't buy fishing equipment and hunting equipment, that excise tax doesn't get paid, and so the funding for wildlife management projects is threatened. And that is a huge issue today in the United States, is this movement away from purchasing hunting and fishing equipment, and at the same time requiring that wildlife management becomes better and more widespread, and which costs money. And so the funding source is really, really in jeopardy right now. But that doesn't mean that society hasn't said, hey, wildlife has great value. There are people and there are economists that study things like what is the value of someone laying down at night in New Jersey and thinking about the mule deer in Nevada and their welfare, and knowing that there are mule deer in Nevada, pick a state, knowing that there are mule deer in Nevada, they sleep better, they have peace of mind, and so they try to put a value on that. It's kind of voodoo economics. But there are economists that try to put values on those kinds of things. And so society has told us we want wildlife and we want it managed appropriately for the most part. And so what we have seen with the passage of the Tailored Grazing Act is since Tailored Grazing Act, since the time that domestic animals were being permitted and controlled, their numbers were being permitted and controlled, excuse me, we have seen drastic, and I mean drastic increases, amazing increases in the number of wildlife species throughout the United States. And I've got some stuff, some numbers down here for you that we can take a look at, just some examples of big game increases just on Department of Interior lands. Now, this doesn't include Forest Service lands or state lands or private lands. This is just Department of Interior lands. And so, look at this. In 1960, I remember 1960, okay? It wasn't that long ago. 1960, we had 140,000 pronghorn antelope on interior lands. By 1990, 300,000. That's a 112% increase. We double the number, more than doubled the number in 30 years between 1960 and 1990. In 2001, I've got some numbers. You'll have to write these down. I didn't include them on your paper. In 2001 on interior lands, there were 408,000 pronghorn antelope censused. 408,000 in 2001. In Nevada, in 2002, there was a census and there was 18,000 pronghorn antelope in 2002 in just Nevada. Elk, 1960 on interior lands, 18,000 elk. By 1990, 150,000 elk. That's a 782% increase. That is phenomenal, the number of elk. Of course, elk, as I've said before, kind of the vermin of the West. You give them a chance, they can live in a parking lot or under a house. By 2001, these are the latest numbers that anybody has. 2001, a census on interior lands indicated that there were 234,000 elk on interior lands. So we've gone from 18,000 in 1960, 150,000 in 1990, to 234,000 in 2001, and undoubtedly there's more there today than this number. That's almost 20 years ago. Deer, both whitetail and mule deer, between 1960 and 1990, we saw about a 0.4 million increase. That was about a 30%. In 2001, we'd had a little bit of a drop back down to about 1.2 million, but there's certainly there's no indication that the mule deer population or the deer population is falling off the rails by any stretch of the imagination. Bighorn sheep, look at that, 4,500 in 1960. 20,000 in 1990, and by 2001, there were 20,500 bighorn sheep on interior lands, and plateaued out there at about 20,000. But look at that increase since 1960. Moose, of course, moose are newcomers. They've only really been in the lower 48. I think that for about 100 years. I think the first moose in Yellowstone showed up about 1905 or something around in there. So in 1960, there were only 750 moose on interior lands, and by 1990 there were 3,500, and by 2001, 30,300. 30,300 mooses. In Wyoming, just to go back to antelope for a moment, in Wyoming, the census in 2004 indicated that there were 490,000 pronghorn antelope in the state of Wyoming, on all the lands in the state of Wyoming, private, interior, and Forest Service lands, the state lands. There's a little more than that there now, as I understand it, a little over 500,000. We can still say that there's more antelope in the state of Wyoming than there are people. So what this should tell you, I mean, the takeaway here is that as we began to manage our domestic animals, as we began to apply science to the practice of grazing on our public lands, we began to see this tremendous increase in habitat quality. And our wildlife has certainly taken advantage of that. Now, one of the other things we have to consider here is that wildlife populations, and indeed domestic any animal population, this is true for any animal population, is that they need forage, and they need water, and they need cover, whether it's thermal cover or predation cover. They need those three things to survive and sustain their populations. Well, along coincident with this increase in forage, with better management, scientific management of our public lands, the science of ecology and rangeland ecology and management, we have better forage, we have more forage, and better forage. We also had water developments that were coincident. And so animal agriculture developed watering points. In order to improve the using the science of rangeland ecology and management, in order to improve distribution, the distribution of domestic animals across the landscape, what we have to do is we have to make sure that water is plentiful, that it is located in places so that you do not have to do a lot of capacity reductions because of distance to water. And so we dug wells, we put up windmills, we've improved springs and seeps, we've piped water, we've used water tanks and piped water all over the West. We have put up little agricultural diversion dams that have created all kinds of summer season habitat, sub-irrigated meadows and irrigated meadows. And so coincident with this improvement in forage availability because of Taylor Grazing Act, we also have this coincident development of water, and wildlife have taken advantage of that, and that alone may be responsible for the greater amount of increase in these wildlife populations in above and beyond what the forage conditions have provided. So we've really done some really good things over the last several decades with respect to wildlife habitat improvements based on forage improvements and water development. Now, this is the last thing I want to mention today, and then I'll cut you loose. When we talk about wildlife habitat, this is a biggie. I have to try and explain this to seasoned wildlife managers even until this day. Not all of them, but some of them. When we talk about wildlife habitat, here's the definition here that I've got for you. Habitat is the natural abode of a plant or animal, including all the biotic, climatic, and edaphic factors affecting life. That's habitat. It's the general definition for habitat. But what you have to understand is that, and it's in bold here, so this is a biggie, right? It's in bold. Habitat is not a discrete location on the surface of the earth. Habitats are seasonal, okay? Wild animals move around on the landscape based on the season of the year. Right now, what wildlife are doing is they are transitioning from salt desert shrub country, lower elevation winter habitat, and they're moving up into spring habitat. Usually it's a little higher in elevation. They're sort of following the green as it greens up on the mountainside. They're moving up those mountains, and then by summertime they'll be on top of the mountains and they'll be up there. Then as the snow in the winter comes, it pushes them back down the mountainside into sort of the winter range, the salt desert shrub winter range. That's a typical model for states like Nevada. Now there's exceptions to it, but that's a typical model. And so habitat is not a discrete place on the Earth's surface. What is good habitat today? What is great seasonal habitat of some type today? For instance, late season brood habitat for sage grouse. Let's use that as an example. What is excellent late season brood habitat for sage grouse today, without any kind of management on that plant community, 20 years, 30 years from now, it will be lousy seasonal habitat in that area. It'll be lousy late season brood habitat. It might be good winter habitat, but it'll be lousy late season brood habitat. Okay? So keep that in your mind. We're going to take up there on Friday and discuss that a little bit more, how this changes over time. So a little bit of time left. If you want to if you got any questions, shoot me some live chat questions here. I'll try and get them answered. And we'll let you go fight your homework for a little while today. So, questions? Shoot them at me if you have them. My wife went to the store yesterday, and there's still no toilet paper on the on the shelves. That's what they're going to write about us in the history books. And this whole thing, the biggest cultural aspect to it was people hoarded toilet paper. You can tell that to your grandchildren one of these days. All right. Seeing no questions. Last chance. Last call. I don't care where you go. You can't stay here. Got $1 for every time I heard that. Yeah. Okay. Boys and berries, bye-bye. Hang and rattle. See you Friday.